Text. It is an afterthought in comics, even if we do not like to admit it. In traditional comic drawing, artists would use an Ames lettering guide to create spaces between lines of text, measured and orderly, to make sure that your lettering looked professionally stylish, instead of like a yard sale sign where you started out with plenty of space, but then the last 3 letters become tragically thin. It was a very intentional and deliberate way of lettering, but it was also extremely slow. But the digital age changed all of that, and now people use computers to letter their comics. It's fast, but now it's not quite so deliberate. The transition made it much easier, but now of course there's an entire horizon of new mistakes that we can make. So I went ahead and made all those mistakes so you don't have to, including using papyrus, in red, over a low contrast background, too small and with no cushion around the text. And I even used it to write out a bad pun. If you think this is good use of papyrus, watch out for crocodiles, because you're in denial. All of my mistakes, both in the last 30 seconds and in the last 15 years, has given me license to warn you of the manifold dangers of text, and to try and give you best practices for putting words into your comics. So in this video, we're going to talk about it in 2 major sections: speech bubbles and text itself, which might sound generic, but I assure you it gets very specific. And then I'll throw in some final tips at the end. Speech bubbles. I also like to call them word bubbles, so if I slip up and say it, I'm talking about the same thing. When I introduce a new concept in class, something like speech bubbles, the questions that I'm going to get are going to be predictably specific. How big should a speech bubble be? How many words should I put in a speech bubble? How much of a panel should a speech bubble make up? These kinds of questions circle around the same basic idea. Is there a standard that we have to follow? Most people, when they're new to something like logo design, illustration, lettering a comic, assume that there's kind of a set of pre-established standards that they can follow, and having followed them can officially say that they have done it properly. But of course, it's not that easy. This is not following a recipe. All of those questions have a litany of correct answers. In this case, specific standards would be much too restrictive for the wide range of scenarios that an illustrator, a comic artist, a letterer is going to encounter. Instead, it's better to change our approach. Rather than looking for a reliable standard to follow, it's better to have a reliable and consistent goal. With text, goals are actually pretty simple and straightforward, quite a bit more so than doing artwork generally for comics or for writing the story. With those, you could create bullet points a mile long of all the different goals that are attempting to be accomplished from page to page. But the goals for text are really much more simple. They are as follows: maximize clarity, minimize confusion, harmonize with the page. That's it, and it makes a pretty simple process. Every decision I make is going to get filtered through those basic goals. People need to be able to read this easily. They need to not get confused when moving from one section of the page to another, and the text should not stand out like a sore thumb. All of the pitfalls that I'm going to tell you about and all of the tips that I'm going to give you are going to be related to these basic goals. So, knowing what we know about the purpose and the goal of the text that we're using, what is a speech bubble? We know that it contains speech and that it's relegated to dialogue at a basic level. But it's even more specific than that. The speech bubble is meant to provide dialogue, but also to indicate to the reader where that speech is coming from. Even if a character is speaking off frame before being dramatically revealed, which is extremely common in comic storytelling, I have to make it clear to the reader that that voice is coming from elsewhere and not an existing character within the scene. This is where the tail of the speech bubble comes in, which is that pointy bit that wobbles around the page towards the speaking character's mouth. And I have found it to be strangely important that it at least suggest the direction of the speaking figure's mouth. I have experimented with this a lot, and I have found that, in general, it doesn't have to go all the way up into their mouth like they're snacking on it, but it has to at least point in the direction of their mouth. If it just points towards their body, it doesn't quite feel right, and I know that's a very scientific assessment. But when I see a tail from a speech bubble that is too low or too vague as to where it's pointing, it always makes me pause for a second with just a little bit of lack of certainty about who's speaking in a given moment. And that pulls me directly out of the immersion of the story. In the very least, you can argue that establishing a pattern for the tale is an important way to keep the reader clear on who's speaking, when, and why. So if I generally have a distance from the mouth and a direction towards the mouth that is common, more often than not, unless it's extremely ambiguous, then people are going to be to follow the pattern that I laid down if I keep it consistent. So my recommendation is to point it towards the mouth, but not to shove it into the teeth. Cushion. This is a classic text problem that manifests everywhere in design that uses typography. It could be magazine design, web design, and of course, speech bubbles. Text has a tendency to feel cramped very easily. You need a buffer of space around the text to make it easy to read. Since it makes the reading comfortable versus uncomfortable, I like to call it cushion. The amount of cushion can depend very much on the environment as well as the size of the type on the page and the size that the page will be shown, either digitally or physically. But in general, I like to use the rule of thumb of about twice the height of the text capital is the buffer space around the text itself. Although I have definitely seen a lot of comics in recent years that go way beyond that with about 4 to 5 times the text height around the text. It seems very excessive. And I really dislike covering up my artwork with empty space around text. So I am going to try and keep that buffer to the minimum while still making it comfortable for the reader. So I got to ask myself that basic question each time I adjust it. Does this affect the reading at all? Does it make me squint when I look at it as I try to read it more closely? Look for those little things that might indicate that you're making it slightly more difficult to read, and be brutally honest with yourself in your assessment. This is one reason, by the way, why I tend to lay down the text first all over the page, and then I go in behind it to paint in the word bubbles. And then I paint in more than I need, and I trim it down to try and get it to the right level. And I don't always do well. Your readers will all carry a navigation bias. They are going to want to read word bubbles in a certain order, in a certain way, and you're going to have to be aware of that bias as you lay out your page. The good news is that you probably dealt with quite a bit of this just when laying out the panels themselves. But laying out the dialogue can reignite many of the same issues because sometimes, in fact often, a panel will have multiple speech bubbles in it. The Western reader is going to have a bias from reading top to bottom, left to right. So when we lay out bubbles, we have to operate underneath this restriction that our audience is bringing to the table. And when we stray from what is typical, we have to compensate some other way to ensure that we are directing them to the correct bubble at a correct time. For example, in this page from Theseus, I move left from right across the page and try to compensate by, one, dropping down a line each time, but also by putting the word bubbles so close together that it's at least obvious, even if not natural, as to which one comes next. And then you get down to this corner and I made it kind of confusing. Not everything is a win. But I did tell you that I made all the mistakes first. So you can subvert this to a certain extent, but it is also difficult, and you have to compensate in some way for the changes that you're making based upon your reader's expectations. Most of the time, it's not even really a stylistic choice. It's just difficult to lay out a comic page in a way that people understand. So the panels themselves can be complex, and then, of course, the speech bubbles and their positioning can also be complex. I tend to exacerbate this issue for myself because I will also change dialogue later in the process. After the page is fully drawn, I'll go back and tweak and change what people are saying in the scene. That, of course, can change the size of word bubbles, which starts the problem over again from the beginning. So in general, you're going to find yourself trying to play into the bias as much as you can just to make a page intelligible. Every row of panels is going to go in order, and then, of course, within those rows, each of the word bubbles is going to have its own left to right, top to bottom pattern. And most people are already doing something like this instinctively, but I have found that when we move from instinctive to intentional choices, we tend to improve at the thing that we were doing at a mediocre level before. Also, let's throw in just a little bit of theory just to soften things up here. And you can find this expounded upon in Scott McCloud's seminal work, Understanding Comics, which if you have not read, you should buy right away. And Scott McCloud did not sponsor this video. Scott McCloud doesn't know that I exist, although I have been trying to tell him telepathically for some time. But according to McCloud, speech bubbles are a good way to create a progression of time within the mind of the reader. A frame without any speech will look like a moment that is frozen in time, like a painting, even if a lot of different activities are taking place within the same frame. But as soon as you add dialogue, this forms a sequence in the reader's mind, and now time is passing within the panel from left to right. That is really fun and very useful for controlling the narrative pace of a scene. One more thing for speech bubbles, not all of them actually have speech in them. Also, they're not bubbles. There's also narration boxes. These can be useful for two different things. One of them is actual narration, like a disembodied narrator, like you used to get in traditional comics. But that fell out of vogue as the famous thought bubble also fell out of vogue. And the narration box became a catch-all for both narration as well as a character's thoughts. The thoughts of the characters can be distinguished from speech as boxes, and that really took off in the 1980s. These kinds of bits of knowledge about comics are useful because they tend to help us work with the expectations of our readers. You can feel free to chart your own path, but be aware that there's certain biases and expectations that are built into the reader, and that you should establish a pattern of whatever it is you want to do early and then stick to that pattern so that as the reader goes through the book or through the comic, that they are able to pick up on the subtle cues as to who's speaking and when and the way that time passes so that they don't get confused throughout the story. Text and fonts. You know, even though traditional lettering died out, it doesn't mean that you can't letter by hand, digitally. In short, one-page comics that I create, I letter by hand. I handwrite all the text on signs when I sell my graphic novels at comic conferences. And if you look at the spine of one of my volumes of Theseus, they are handwritten. I also handwrite the text on all my captions and videos and the thumbnails that you see on YouTube. And eventually I'll probably put together a video on how and why I do all of those things. But for right now, let's focus on the reality. Most of the time, handwriting text is not what we do. We use fonts, which have both their advantages and their disadvantages in comic work. In the body text of my graphic novels, I use fonts for both speed, efficiency, and consistency. A quick little note here, I get asked a lot which word is correct, font or typeface. These do have different definitions, but font has become kind of a catch-all word in modern design. Specifically though, typeface refers to the design of the type. So Helvetica, Papyrus, Comic Sans, these are typefaces that I'm describing. And font refers to a specific usage. For example, both the typeface and the size and the weight, etc., etc. That's the basic difference. So the first thing we're going to do is go hunting for a typeface. I'm not going to give an exhaustive list of sources for typefaces because I have not researched it exhaustively. Instead, I'm just going to tell you what I've done. I went to Blambot, and it has a host of options based on various lettering styles. I bought Cloud Splitter because it has an uppercase and a lowercase, and it had just a bit of an ancient world edge that would fit nicely with my graphic novel that's set in ancient Greece. I'm aware that many of these typefaces cost money, and no, I am not sponsored by them either. But no matter where you get your typeface from, I actually do recommend buying one. For one, typefaces are difficult to make and are the product of true craftsmanship, just like comics themselves. For another, $30 in the grand scheme of making a comic is nothing. You can use that typeface ad infinitum. Well, at least most of the time. Check the end user license agreement. And if you can, it is well worth it. And then finally, good craft is worth real money. It's both well made and it is useful to me. And that means exchanging money for it is utterly just. If your finances allow for it, buy good tools to use. If your finances do not allow for it, make do with something lesser until you have put aside money that you can use to purchase the tool that would be useful to you. Now, shopping for a typeface is going to force you to ask all kinds of questions of how the type should be used within your comic. What style are you looking for? Should you use something that is all caps all the time, or title case, which is both upper and lowercase? People have extremely strong opinions on that question. You also need to think about how that typeface is going to be used. Is it just dialogue? Narration? Is it descriptive columns of text with illustrations going alongside it? One of the mistakes that new comic creators tend to make is they really only think about that first question. What is the style that I'm looking for? But there's a lot of intricacy to fonts and typefaces that we have to consider if you want it to work as well as it possibly can. So maybe I go to Blambot and I pick Death Rattle because it's free to use and because it fits the style of my death metal comic about two electric guitars that find love against all odds. But as soon as you start to type it out in paragraph form, you realize that is not what this typeface was made for. Years ago, I was struggling to communicate this problem to my students, so I came up with a visual scheme to help them understand, and I call it the scale of type neutrality. So you can put a typeface on a scale from distinct to neutral, meaning that some typefaces on this end are as close to the basic letter forms as possible, minus emotional signals. And on the other end, typefaces are not emotionally neutral at all, but they are charged with signals to direct the emotional tone. In the process, the letter forms are somewhat corrupted, and the more text you have of that typeface, such as big block paragraphs, will make it harder and harder to read. This means there's a trade-off that occurs. The more neutral a typeface is, the easier it is to have a lot of it and still have it be legible. But the more emotionally charged a typeface is, the harder it is to read when there's a lot of it. So a highly distinct type will be great for a word or a few words, and it will be brimming with impact. But neutral fonts are quiet and step aside and kind of let the writing do all of the talking. They are impassive messengers, trying not to take a hand in the impact of the work and thereby work really well in large amounts of text, tightly packed. So for dialogue, we usually want a typeface that is on the neutral side, even if it's not all the way to the edge of that spectrum. And as long as you understand your trade-offs, you can make a lot of different approaches work. Leading. When it comes to whether to use uppercase, lowercase, or title case, these are largely matters of preference. But one thing they do is change the leading of the text. Leading is the gaps between the lines of type and is named for the pieces of lead that were traditionally used to make those gaps in the days of the printing press. With all uppercase, you need a bit more leading in order to keep the text from feeling cramped. With title case and lowercase, the gap is already somewhat built in because the lowercase letter forms are obviously shorter than the capitals. The height of the lowercase in reference to the uppercase is called X height, and it actually varies quite a bit from typeface to typeface. So you have to adjust your leading based upon the spacing and the X height that comes with a particular font. And you shoot for comfortable cushion, just like the cushion that you leave outside the edges. It doesn't have to be quite so much, but you do want a reading comfort that separates the lines of text. Comfortable cushion, not excess. Kerning. Unfortunately, you also have to worry about kerning, which is the space between individual letters within your text. Each typeface that you download automatically sets up the spacing between any pairing of letters. And you might think that that is a simple, consistent number, but Latin letter forms vary so much in shape that it can change depending on what letter is next to what. The famous example is V and A, but there are many pairings in the Latin alphabet that are atypical in their spacing. So you, as the letterer, have to be conscious of that kerning. And don't take for granted the spacing between letters is automatically optimal when you type the word out. However, this is not a huge issue with small dialogue. Typically, the text is so small at that stage that the discrepancies in spacing don't make a big difference. This is really something you have to worry about primarily on titles, subtitles, and any text that is large, like a sound effect. So don't fall into the temptation of zooming in very close and kerning all of your text carefully. That's something the reader will never really see. Instead, focus on looking at it at about the size of the page as it would actually manifest, either digitally or in print, and then adjust kerning based upon what you can see from that level of zoom. Kerning is primarily about consistency. So whether the space between letters is going to be very small, where you're putting them together like puzzle pieces, or if you're planning to use all caps and to spread them out, tracking them like the text that you see on a movie title. Just try to make a pattern and stick to it. And it doesn't really have to be more complicated than that. Maximize clarity, minimize confusion, harmonize with the page. Size. Another thing that I tend to get asked a lot is about what size of text is proper for reading. And there are easy answers to that question because there are actually some conventions in play there. But the digital world has made it much more complicated. You see that type size dropdown in every word processor that sets it by default at 11 or 12 points, and then goes up to 72, is using a very old-fashioned sizing system dating back to the era of the printing press, where most of our terminology comes from. So these numbers are based on real-world sizes. The reason it tops out at 72 point, for example, is because 72 points is equal to 1 inch. So a capital letter at 72 points is 1 inch from the very top to the baseline. That means that 12 points is 1/6 of an inch, which is called a pica. There are 6 picas in an inch. So why does digital make this more complicated? Because a computer does not care how big an inch is. Computers measure things by pixels, which does not have a relationship to the physical external world. That's why I can watch the same video on a smartphone and on a 50-inch TV. The image will expand to fit whatever size is necessary. So when something digital is being printed, either we or the software has to tell it exactly how many pixels will fit into an inch. It turns out the human eye has some limitations, and even when we're holding something close physically, we can really only see about 300 pixels across the width of an inch. Printers have no real reason to develop beyond that level, so the vast majority of the time what you're getting is 300 pixels per inch being printed with any book or image that you see. The good news is that most softwares are going to take care of this for you if you set up the document according to real physical sizes, like inches or centimeters. You might have to make sure that it says that it's at 300 pixels per inch or higher just for printing's sake, but the text size should take care of itself. But not every software does this, and sometimes you can get errors by exporting from one software and moving to another software. For example, I usually draw at 600 ppi just to have a little bit of extra wiggle room so that I can zoom in and work without getting pixelation. And I use multiple softwares in my workflow, so mine is all messed up. So even though 10 point is a pretty standard size for the printing world, I have not found it dependable in software for me to just set it there and assume that everything is good. And sometimes I'm not designing for print. Sometimes I'm designing something to go onto social media or to the web generally. And the text size needs to correspond with what people will see on their smartphones, or as I call them, misery rectangles. The solution for all of this is really very simple. It's trial and error. So you could save out a comic page with some different type samples on it and then send it to your printer. Most often, even a home printer will have an option that allows you to see it at actual size. It will just crop it, whatever is necessary in order to get it to that size. Then you can just look at it and see how that text reads at that size. If you wanted something more elaborate, even a small town will probably have a local print shop. You can send it to them and have them print it at real size and then look at it and see which type size works the best. What you're going to want to do is to go with the smallest size possible that is still very easy to read, because that way you're maximizing the amount of space that you have on the page, but you're still making it comfortable for the reader. If you find yourself squinting at it, it's too small. Be brutally honest with yourself. Again, with the digital comics, this is even easier. Size something according to your best judgment and just send it to someone you trust via message. I usually send stuff to my wife constantly from my computer using Discord, and at this point she's learned not to really pay much attention to it. I'm going to come in and take her phone and look at it. The same thing applies here in the digital context as well. Get the text as small as possible, while making sure that you can still read it comfortably. Invariably, the text is going to have to be larger on a digital comic than it is on a print comic, just because the page is obviously going to be quite a bit bigger than the Misery Rectangle. The era of reading webcomics on desktops and laptops is at an end. Webtoons on the Misery Rectangle is here, so you're going to need bigger text. Obstinately, I still post my comic page by page on my own website, which you can read for free. And there's a link in the description. And then I have to resize the text for printing once the volume is done, which is a pain. Final tips. First, just remember the basic goals. Increase clarity, decrease confusion, harmonize with the page. So when you put the text on the page, make sure that the text can be easily read from the background, not just by size, but also by contrast. Text should always have space allocated for it, whether by word bubbles, or in the case of titles, space allotted around it in order to provide it a bed, a place where it is meant to sit. Text that is placed over a background that is both dark in some areas and light in others tends to create contrast problems, because the text is constant in its color and the background is not, and inevitably somewhere around those edges you're going to get some muddying of the contrast. So again, use your instincts, be brutally honest with yourself. Is it harder to read? The same goes with the speech bubbles and their tails. I really like to color code speech bubbles according to which character is speaking, and this creates contrast problems all the time. Sometimes I have to alter the color of the tail to solve this problem, and it is never ideal. Number 2, don't make handwritten typefaces too big. Don't take a font that is designed to look handwritten and to make it large. Since most comic fonts are designed to have the look of something organic, but are not actually organically handwritten, when you make them large for titles or for sound effects, it becomes extremely obvious that they are not handwritten, and they are far too smooth and digital looking. Keep those fonts as small as they are designed to be, and if you need to have big text for titles or for sound effects, either use different typefaces that aren't designed to look organically handwritten, or just handwrite your own. Alright, that is a hefty dose of information on speech bubbles and text. Hopefully this is helpful to you if you're looking to make comics yourself, or entertaining for you if you just find it interesting to hear people talk about fonts. Either way, this series on comicking will continue and will be interspersed throughout with other videos where I explore various things on art and illustration. So thank you for watching. Like, subscribe, do all of those things that I forgot to mention earlier in the video, and now you're all already gone. And I'm alone. I'm okay with it.